Okay, imagine this. You're on your Southeast Alaska whale watching trip. A humpback whale appears out of nowhere 30 yards from the boat. You turn to grab your camera, try to hunt for focus, and the whale disappears. Hey there, my name's Michael, and I created Capture Alaska because I noticed after taking over 1,000 visitors out on whale watching and hiking trips while teaching photography that people were learning their cameras after they arrived in Alaska. With Capture Alaska, my goal is to help you feel comfortable and confident with your camera before you go on your trip so you can take amazing photos when you get to Alaska. In this video, I'm going to go over things like whale behavior, settings you can use on your camera, and most importantly, how you can practice photographing whales before you arrive in Alaska, no matter where you live. If you follow what we go through in this video and you get this practice in before you go, you're going to be in really good shape to photograph whales once you're on your vacation. Now let's talk about the whales you are likely to see in Alaska and the types of behaviors they typically display. So you're likely to see humpback whales. Between May and September, you're virtually guaranteed to see humpback whales in Southeast Alaska. So in the winter, they're mating out in Hawaii, and they're swimming back for the summers in Alaska to feed on krill and herring and other small fish, fill up their giant bellies before they go back to Hawaii the following winter. So when you see them, what you're going to see first is a big spout. So they're exhaling when they're reaching the surface, and that's to breathe before they dive back down looking for food. They're going to breathe usually several times before you really see the whale itself. And it's really helpful because you're not looking for some sudden movement that you have to capture in a split second. You're just looking for the spout at first. Now once you've found the spout, the whale is going to start arching its back a little bit before it dives back down. So you might see the whale come up out of the water, you see its dorsal fin, might keep on moving for a while, it might just be hanging out, but then before it dives back down, you're going to see a big arch in its back. Because after you see that arch, the whale dives down, and that's when you might see the tail come out of the water. And that's a really cool, classic Alaska shot to get, is the whale diving down to feed and getting the tail as it's diving down. So here are a few things you can do to make sure you're getting great photos of whales as they're diving down to feed. First is starting to look at your focus as the whale is gliding along the surface, right? Because this isn't a sudden movement, because they're coming up to breathe, move along the surface before diving down, that gives you time to set your focus and make sure the whale is going to be clear in the frame when you're taking the photo. The best way I've found to do this is turning on continuous autofocus. So that's the AFC on a lot of cameras, or on a Canon, the AI servo. What that means is instead of regular autofocus that is intended to focus on a still subject, this is continuing to focus as a subject moves. And a little box is going to appear on your screen, and you can adjust the size of that box to fit the whale in it. So when the whale's gliding along the surface, having continuous shooting turned on, AFC, making sure that whale is in frame, and then as it moves, as it dives down, your camera is going to keep focusing for you. And then you just got to worry about pressing that shutter at the right time as it's diving down. Now if your camera doesn't have that, or maybe you have a manual camera, say you have manual focus, you'd set that focus on the whale as it's gliding along the surface. So you set that manual focus as it's kind of breathing and gliding along, and then you just have to worry about hitting the shutter as it starts to arch its back and dive down into the water. Now if you're new to manually changing the settings on your camera, what I would recommend doing is practicing in shutter priority mode, which is going to oftentimes be found on your camera dial. Shutter priority mode is going to be the S on a lot of camera dials, or the TV if you have a Canon. And basically what that means is the camera is going to select everything except your shutter speed. You're going to select your shutter speed, the camera is going to figure everything else out. And when you're photographing whales, your shutter speed is very important. In short, your shutter speed is how quickly the camera is opening and closing its shutter to take the photo. And if there's any movement while that's happening, that could create a blur. So you want a really fast shutter speed. For whales, depending on the situation, I'm usually over 1/1000th of a second. That means the shutter is opening and closing in 1/1000th of a second. Really fast. That way, if you're moving, if the boat's moving, and the whale's moving, it's going to be clear. So if you use a shutter speed that's too slow, what you're going to find is there's going to be blur in the image, and that's the biggest thing we want to avoid. So if you're not comfortable fully manually changing everything on your camera, that is what I would recommend using, and that's something you can practice ahead of time. Now, in addition to shooting in shutter priority mode, I also recommend shooting with continuous shooting or burst mode turned on. What that's going to do is when you click that camera shutter, when you press down that camera shutter all the way and you hold it, it's going to take a bunch of photos in a row. So a great thing to do is really when that whale starts to arch its back, start holding down that shutter, and then it goes and starts getting a bunch of photos in a row, and then you can capture that whole motion down. And getting a whole sequence of that whale diving into the water is really neat. I highly recommend practicing this ahead of time, because then you can see how fast continuous shooting works on your camera, what type of memory card you have, and that'll help you get a feel for when you should start and when you should stop. If you start too early, if right when you see the whale you start pressing down that shutter and just keep holding it, eventually the camera's trying to write all of that information to the SD card, so it's going to have to buffer for a little bit. So some cameras, you can hold it down, it's going to burst for like 5 seconds, and then there's a big pause because the camera has to think, it has to write and save all of those photos you just took so you can take more. And exactly when that occurs is dependent on your camera. So that's why practicing ahead of time, very, very beneficial. Now remember, shifting into shutter priority mode, having your autofocus set to AFC for continuous, that is something you can do even before you get on the boat. So a lot of what comes down to success with photographing whales is just preparing ahead of time. Having that stuff kind of set up and ready to go before you get on the boat, and then you're going to be in really good shape. Again, there's more to it than just those things, but if you're just getting started, I think that's going to drastically increase your likelihood of success. Now let's talk a little bit about camera gear and what types of gear are really helpful for photographing whales. So if you have an interchangeable lens camera, that's a great option, and I'd recommend bringing a zoom lens, which is a telephoto lens. You're able to zoom in on the subject, which is really helpful for whales when they're further away from the boat. I have used a 100 to 400 millimeter lens with a lot of success over the years. That's a really nice option. There's a lot of lenses that fit that range. So you can start at 100 millimeters, which is zoomed out a little more, and then zoom in onto the subject once you see it. If you have a prime lens or a fixed focal length lens that's really zoomed in at like 600 millimeters or something, it's going to be difficult to actually find the subject, because with whales, you don't know where they're going to pop up. You don't know how far they're going to be from the boat. So somewhere around a 100 to 400 millimeter lens is a really nice option. Also, don't forget about your smartphone. Smartphones are amazing, especially for video. I really emphasize with folks taking video while you're taking photos. So if you're with a group and you want to be taking photos and you've got someone else with you, ask them to take some slow motion video on their smartphone. A lot of phones now have the option to increase the frame rate. A typical video frame rate is 30 frames per second. Some of these are going up over 100 now. So you could end up slowing down your video and getting a really cool slow motion video of a whale diving down. Now, other types of behaviors that you might encounter. We talked a lot about whales diving down because that's what they're doing in the summers in Alaska. That's what you're most likely to see. Now, I'll talk briefly about some less common behaviors. I don't want you to expect to see these in Alaska. If you do, consider yourself lucky, and there's a few things to keep in mind. So one thing that a lot of people ask about is breaching. That's when a whale is jumping out of the water. Now, that's not something they're doing all that often in Alaska because they're so focused on eating. It's also something that we have a lot of theories about why they do it, but we don't actually know with certainty what causes that. So if you see a breaching whale, there's going to be no indication that it's about to happen. They're just going to shoot out of the water, and who knows where it's going to be. So it's a lot harder to prepare for. But if you do see one, the principles of your shutter speed are the same. You want it to be really fast, and you're going to have to get it in focus really quickly as well. So if you just see one breach and then you don't see anything for a while, that might be kind of hard to capture. But what can happen, especially if you see a mother whale with their baby, with their little calf next to them, the young humpbacks are a lot more likely to be playful and exhibit some of those more unusual behaviors. So if you see a little one that breaches out of the water, they might start breaching like over and over. And that's when your likelihood of getting a photo really increases. You might see a baby that shoots out of the water, goes back down, 30 seconds later shoots out again, and every once in a while they'll start doing that in the same place. It might just be the baby playing around. And that's when you can turn on your continuous focus, you can turn on your burst mode, and every time it shoots out of the water, really try to capture that. Now, the most important part of the video, which is practice. A lot of people think because photographing whales is such a unique thing that other than learning settings, you can't really prepare ahead of time. And that's just not true. There's a lot of things you can do at home to simulate a whale in the water that will really help you when the time comes. So if you have a cat or a dog, absolutely use those as subjects to prepare. What you can do with your pet is have them run around the yard, have them run around the house, and turn on that continuous autofocus. Mess with that box, how much you want to remain in focus, and try to track them as they're running around. That's going to make a huge difference and just help you get comfortable with that autofocus setting. Secondly, while they're doing that, turn on burst mode, get your shutter speed over 1/1000th of a second, and take a bunch of photos and see if they're coming out clear, and adjust accordingly as you're working through that. If you have a family member or a friend or a child that wants to run behind the house and jump out really quickly and just start running around, get them in focus. Again, turn on burst mode, try to track them as they're running around. These might seem kind of silly, but they're really going to help you. Another thing you can do is have someone drive you around. Roll down the window while you're in the passenger seat and practice getting something in focus while you're moving, because that boat might see something really cool while it's in motion. Another option is going to a local park. If they have geese, if they have ducks, those are excellent subjects. You'll see them on the surface of the water, diving down, looking for fish, coming back up. These are all things you can practice your burst mode, your autofocusing, and your shutter speed. Now, if you're somewhere with access to a pool, have someone dive off the diving board into the water. This might be the most direct comparison to a whale that is feeding in Alaska. Try to get that full sequence as they're diving into the water. Again, achieving focus, making sure your shutter speed is fast enough, and anticipating behavior. Those things are going to vastly increase your chances of getting great photos while you're whale watching. Now, if you practice what we talked about today at home, you are going to be ready to go for your whale watching trip in Alaska. And while you're practicing, if you have any questions, let me know and I will answer them. If you have an Alaska trip planned, feel free to follow along or go to my website at capturealaskatours.com. You can also email me any questions at michael@capturealaskatours.com. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.